This week on Q&A, Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department Chief Cathy Lanier discusses her life and her career in law enforcement.
Cathy Lanier, what's the toughest part of being the Chief of Police of the Washington Metropolitan Police Department?
It's really not a tough job. It is the toughest part, I guess, in the first couple of years was the toughest part. Getting used to the press was a challenge. Other than that, maybe sometimes a little bit of the politics, but being a police officer is what I've done my whole adult life. So being a police chief's not that much different. Tough part was getting used to dealing with the press.
How many officers do you have?
We're about 4,000 sworn, and then I have about 500 civilian.
So why is the press tough or difficult?
Well, it's Washington, D.C., so the press is different here. Everything is national news almost, and some of the simplest little things seem to just go viral in the press. It's sometimes puzzling why the things that the press focuses on are of such interest and for so long. But just learning how to kind of manage that constant beast. It seems that everybody needs a story all the time, and public safety is such a big part of reporting in Washington, D.C. So it's every day we deal with lots and lots of press.
So what are your own personal rules about dealing with an interview situation?
Well, one thing that I've learned is that all too often in law enforcement, when we get asked questions, especially questions about crime and things like that, we always say no comment. We can't talk about that. We can't talk about that. So my rule of thumb is I always try and tell you what I can tell you, because there's always something I can tell you. So if I can't comment on, for example, there was a case where there was an allegation that an officer had made a threat regarding the First Lady. And so clearly there's an investigation that's going on, there's personnel matters, you can't discuss any of that. But what I can do is I can talk about, here's the process. The process is we'll do our investigation, Secret Service will do a threat analysis investigation, then it'll be passed on for disposition. So I always try and find what it is I can tell the press, because they got a job to do. And if I say nothing, they're going to report something anyway. So that's kind of my rule of thumb.
I have a piece of paper here. It says district crime data at a glance, and I go back to 1993. Were you on the force?
I was. Came on in 1990.
There were 454 murders in the District of Columbia.
479 my first year.
That was what year?
1990.
And this last year, 2012, there were 88.
Yes.
What happened?
A lot of things have happened. I think the initial decline from the up to 500 down to the 200 range, that decline over about a 10-year period was the kind of burning out of the crack cocaine epidemic. That was a 20-year run of sheer hell for most cities. The violence associated with crack cocaine markets, we had 200 open-air markets in the city. When shootings would happen, they would be drive-bys and 6 or 7 people would be shot or killed in a single incident. So as the crack cocaine epidemic started to wane, we dropped down from the high 400s down in the 200 range, 250, and we kind of stayed there for some time.
Why did it wane?
Because that's kind of the way, if you look at drug patterns, drugs tend to spike in popularity. They remain there about 15, 16 years, and then they run like 20-year cycles, and then they go down. And so the crack cocaine epidemic is no more. There are still people who use cocaine. There are still people who use crack cocaine, but it is nowhere near where it used to be. So with the absence of that driving the violence, I think that dropped us down, in the 200 range. But we got stuck there for a long time. In fact, even when I took over in 2007, we were 169 in 2006, 181 in 2007, 186 in 2008. We were persistent with gang violence, and gang violence was born and accelerated during the crack cocaine years. So even when the crack cocaine went away, the gangs didn't. So really after that, coming down from that 186 down to where we are now, in 4 years, about a 54% drop in murders. It has been constant focus on our gangs, the higher end gun offenders, illegal gun offenders. and just really staying focused on those two things and bringing the community in to work with us. That's been absolutely key in dropping at that last 54%.
The mayor of this town in 1989 was Marion Barry. I want to run a short video clip of him speaking at the press club.
Let me just say that nearly half of the 372 homicides, the targeted killings, occurred east of the Anacostia River. Communities plagued by high unemployment, high rate of school dropouts, poor housing, single-family female heads of household, and other social ills that have had a negative effect on the poorest among us. If you look at a map of where these killings occur, you'll see that there are about 60% of the open-air drug markets are in two police districts, the 4th District and the 7th District. The 7th District, east of the Anacostia River, the 4th District in Northwest Washington. These murders are targeted killings.
What did you hear there, and what were you doing in 1989?
I hadn't come on yet. I started in 1990, but the 4th District that he referred to is where I started. In fact, when I started there, right after coming out of the academy, we had a week's worth of riots in Mount Pleasant, where the entire area was just completely out of control, looting, burning. I think they torched about 6 or 7 of our police cars in those riots. But that's a very accurate description of what I remember when I came on.
What was it like for you when you started on the street?
Well, the city was a very different place. Financially, the city was in shambles. I mean, we had my first car. I walked a footbeat for a few years because we just didn't have any cars, and the cars we had were in such poor shape. The first car I was assigned to had 127,000 miles on it. So, you know, financially, the city was just broken. So it made policing that much more challenging with the, you know, equipment and resources. But, you know, I enjoyed walking a footbeat. I think that was my favorite assignment in my entire career. I learned more about policing by being just embedded in a community, knowing everybody, being so sensitive to things in my beat that I'd notice if a car was normally parked in a certain place at a certain time, it would catch my attention if it wasn't there. So I think that's one of the most effective forms of policing, and I learned the most doing that. But murders every single day. Every single day, 1, 2, sometimes 3 murders in a shift.
When I first met you today, my first thought was, oh, I didn't know she was that tall.
Everybody says that.
Because in a picture, you just don't look that tall. Yeah. How tall are you?
5'11".
What part has that played?
And if we can get in, that I'm much skinnier than I look on TV, too.
Everybody is. What part did that play in your life as a policeman, being tall?
You know, I don't think so much. I think really there's a misperception by the public sometimes that policing is all about brute force and brawn, and policing is so much more about communication, being a good communicator and talking with people and building rapport with people, good and bad. So I can't ever think of a time that my height has ever played more of a role than people always saying, gosh, I didn't know you were that tall.
You know, a couple of years ago when Mayor Adrian Fenty was elected, I remember that you, Michelle Rhee, and Mayor Fenty were all under 40.
Yes.
You're the only one of those, that threesome left. And how old are you now?
I'm 45. I remember the headline, talk about the press. See, there's the thing that's like, I remember there was an article in the Washington Post, and it was interesting because somebody had, you know, done little bubbles over the Adrian Fenty and I, our heads, and it says, you know, you've got a 36-year-old mayor and a 39-year-old police chief. This is Generation X. But the byline was, you know, we're giving it all over to Generation X. Don't blow it. And I thought, wow, that's pressure.
How do you think you got the job?
Well, you know, I had been on 17 years at the time. I was the district commander. I was one of the youngest district commanders in the city. I was the district commander in charge of the 4th District. Adrian Fenty, right after I took over the 4th District, Adrian Fenty took over as the Ward 4 council member. He was, just like he was as the mayor, he was very high speed, very, you know, big on accountability. So we had a lot of the same personality traits in terms of, you know, really focusing on accountability and customer service and responsiveness. So we worked very well together. But then I didn't see him after I left the 4th District and went to Special Operations Division. I didn't see him for a couple of years. And when he was running for mayor, he stopped in to visit a couple of times, and I hadn't seen him for a couple of years. But I think it was just the sheer fact that Adrian Fenty knew how I policed. He knew how I managed, and he knew that my priorities were similar to his. And I remember telling him when he asked me if I wanted the job, you know, you're going to take a huge hit, you know, if you appoint me. You know, a commander, so they'd be jumping a rank. I'm 39 years old. I'm a white female. And he says, I don't care about any of that. He goes, I know you can do the job. So
I understand from doing a little research that people behind your back call you Blondie.
Well, actually, it's a name I got on the street when I used to walk a footbeat. I still, when I go into the neighborhood where I used to work in Northwest and 4D, I will run into people all the time that I encountered who yell Blondie out as I go down the street. So.
Did it bother you?
No. Mm-mm. Everybody in Washington, D.C. has a nickname. So.
But if an officer of yours came up and said, hey, Blondie.
Some of them, the ones I used to work with, do. I mean, you got to remember, I've been on 23 years, and I am the average member of the Metropolitan Police Department. They are my age, they're my group. We came on 89, 90, you know, the vast majority of us. So I've worked alongside, worked with, supervised or managed the vast majority of the people in the police department. I know them all by first name. I know their habits. I know who's a good cop and who's, you know, not as energetic as other cops. So I know them all. That's been a huge advantage for me.
So who's your boss?
My boss, I have a couple of bosses. I've got the mayor, of course, the city administrator, and the deputy mayor, Paul Quander.
But if you look on the list of how many police departments there are in this area, I mean, it's 25.
Actually, I think it's 34.
Yeah, I mean, that's all I could only find 25.
But a lot of them are confined to buildings. I mean, to be fair, you know, the Supreme Court has a police department. They police the Supreme Court. The Capitol Police has a police department that's almost as large as mine, about half the size of mine, that polices the Capitol. So other than the Metropolitan Police and the U.S. Park Police, and to a certain extent the Metro Transit Police that patrol the transit system, everybody else is really very narrowly confined. And Park Police really polices the green spaces, the Park Service areas. We are the only police department in the city that, I put it to people this way all the time. If you dial 911, it's my phone that's going to ring, not any of theirs.
So what happens if there's something in the city that happens to a public official and they must go to the hospital? We've had many cases of that over the years. Who's in charge then?
It all depends on who that person is. If it is a protectee of the Secret Service, they would be lead, we support. If it is a State Department protectee, they would be lead, we support. But regardless of who it is, any homicide in the District of Columbia, statutorily, the Metropolitan Police Department is the only agency that can investigate.
What's the best training for a policeman?
Well, I said it before, I'll say it again. The best training you can get to become a really good police officer and understand what it's all about is walking a footbeat. I will say that till the day I die. You learn how to develop sources. You learn how to use intelligence information. You learn how to leverage relationships in the community, and that is the key. If people in a community trust you, they'll tell you when the things that are happening that are not yet crime, so that you can intervene. And they'll tell you all about how to go about doing it. I've really learned the most in my career from those relationships.
Why did you, a couple years ago, give a commencement address at DeMatha High School in 2010?
My son, who I'm so proud of, graduated from DeMatha, and they asked me if I'd come and give a commencement speech. I have to tell you, that was the most stress I'd ever been under in my life, giving a speech. DeMatha High School, my son graduated from there. As a DeMatha mom, it was very stressful to go give that speech.
Let's look at a little bit of that speech.
All right. Going to junior high school back in the 80s, kids from my neighborhood were bused into another neighborhood for school. And that's where my life began to change. I was bused to a neighborhood in Fairmont Heights, and each day, from the first day, when the kids on my bus got off that bus, we were promptly jumped by the neighborhood kids, who clearly didn't think we belonged there. This went on for about 2 years. I began to skip school, miss class, get into trouble. I went from a straight A student in a talented and gifted program to failing the 8th grade because of attendance, which is why I was so impressed with the 750 some days without a day off. But honestly, no child can learn in an environment where fear generates all day long in the school.
Jumped. By why?
Well, that's I don't think unique to Washington, D.C., but one thing that is still pervasive, and it was what drove a lot of the gang issues we've had up until today, is neighborhoods. Neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. seem to be just territory that are owned by the people in those neighborhoods. It's neighborhood against neighborhood. And, we were bused into a neighborhood that wasn't our neighborhood. And every day when we got off the bus, there was busloads of kids that came from 2 different areas outside of the neighborhood. And both of the buses, eventually we figured out that we could combat this by joining forces and jumping them when we got off the bus after we got a little better at it. But it was just a horrible experience for kids to try and go to school and learn in that environment. That's why I put so much emphasis now as the chief on making sure kids can go to school and be safe.
How many kids do you have?
How many kids do I have? I have 1.
And when you started this job, your personal story, everybody wanted to talk about, and you said, I don't want to be one of those that's on the freaky talk shows, but I got to ask you, because people out there that have never heard the story, what is it? What happened when you were in junior high school?
Yeah, that was the hard part about the press, too. My personal story was more important in my first year as the police chief in Washington, D.C. than you could imagine. Well, I guess the interest is that I ran away from home, dropped out of school, 14, 15 years old, got married, had my son when I was 15. So I was a single mom with a 9th grade education when I started. When I came here to MPD, I started with a GED, but basically a 9th grade education. But over the last 20 years, so because I made that great decision to drop out of school, I spent 20 years trying to catch up and go back to school, and now I have 2 master's degrees. So I tried to make up for it, but it sure was the hard way.
Why'd you run away from home?
Well, because I was a teenager, thought I knew everything. I was failing in school because I'd been skipping school. Thought I was in love, wanted to get married, and then I got pregnant. So.
Where did you live during that time when you got married?
In a small apartment just outside of Washington, D.C.
What happened to your relationship with your parents?
Well, with my mom, I was raised by a single mom. So my mother is the sole reason that I am where I am today. She was obviously devastated. She was a wonderful mother. She did everything right, everything she could.
Is she alive?
Oh, yes. In fact, she lives with me now. I take care of her. So she was on the other foot. She was wonderful. She stood by me when I got divorced and I moved back home. My mother had very, very little money. We were poor growing up. She took me and my son back in, and what little she had, she shared with us. She helped me raise my son. She helped me get my son into private school, helped me pay some of the bills with what little money she had. She made it possible for me to be where I am today. So my mother's been great.
What were those early jobs you had in order to make money?
I was a secretary. My mother taught me how to type at home. I was a secretary. I worked as a waitress. I started working when I was 15, and I worked 2 jobs the first 3 or 4 years. So I was working as a secretary during the day and working as a waitress at night.
And what has this story done for your relationship with the average person out there?
Well, as horrified as I was, the first story came out from a reporter to Washington Post right after I was named, and I was just horrified. Some of the headlines in the press, I think there was one, teen welfare mom topped to be nation's top cop. I always say if I could get my hands on those headline writers, that would just be not good. But honestly, I think over time, for the people that I interact with and work with in the community every day, the people that I try and help, I think for those folks, they don't see it as bad at all. They see it as opportunities that that you can make it regardless of your circumstances, and they know that it gives me a different perspective. There's a lot of people that are poor, living in these communities that through no fault of their own. We grew up very poor. My mother didn't do anything wrong. She was a great parent. She worked hard. So I think it helps some for me to relate to people and people to relate to me.
I read that your father, your 2 brothers are firemen?
Yes, yes, yes. And my father was a firefighter. He was the deputy chief just outside the district in Prince George's County. My oldest brother just retired. He was a captain, fire department. My other brother is a police officer.
So what impact did that have on you getting into police work?
Probably a lot. You know, I didn't have this lifelong dream to be a police officer. I remember when my oldest brother went in the fire department, my other brother started in the police department. And I really wasn't interested. I had a good job. I was working, and I liked the jobs I had. But I remember when they had the big push for police officers, not long after that speech that you showed of Marion Barry, it was advertisements in the paper saying the Metropolitan Police Department was doing a mass hire, and they were looking to hire 1,000 people. And in the ad, what caught my eye, because at the time I only had a GED, and I was trying to go back to school so I could put my son in a better school. And they said they get tuition reimbursement for college. And that's what got me. I was like, that's what I need. Because I was taking 1 or 2 classes at a time in a community college, and it would have taken me forever. So that's what got me.
You went to Johns Hopkins?
I got my bachelor's and master's from Hopkins in management, and then I got my second master's in Homeland Security from the Naval Postgraduate.
I've got a quote from something you said in 2005 before you became chief. No experience in my life has had more of an impact on doing my job than going to Israel.
Oh, yeah.
Explain.
Well, Chief Ramsey, who was the former chief in MPD, asked me to take over the Special Operations Division immediately after 9/11. He wanted me to recreate basically the capabilities of our police department in terms of Homeland Security, counterterrorism. So I traveled all over the world looking at studying Homeland Security issues and intelligence. And I took a 10-day trip to Israel. And I took a lot of notes when I was there. I think I come back with 88 pages of notes. I met with a lot of different officials in Israel, but just watching the way of life in Israel. There actually was a suicide bus bombing when I was there. Watching the way of life of the people in a place where terrorism is every day was just one of the most eye-opening things for me in terms of trying to develop policy and tactics for the Metropolitan Police Department. I don't ever want to see our country, our city living like that. So it really inspired me to put together, I think, a very strong capability inside the police department.
What did you change?
Everything. The culture. That was it, culture. We really, our wake-up call probably should have come after Oklahoma City, and it didn't. Local police, we didn't have that wake-up call until 9/11. It was far too late. We should have done it long before that. So completely changing the culture of local law enforcement to understand our duty and our responsibility, and it's a big one, to keep our city safe from terrorism. And it's evolved some since 9/11, but it is all the same thing. I mean, we have lone wolf, radical individuals, and we have state-sponsored terrorism, all those things. It has evolved over time, but understanding that regardless of what that threat is, local police have a huge role in preventing it to begin with. But we have to be prepared so that when something happens, that no additional loss of life happens because we're not prepared.
Can you give us an idea of something that is done on a daily basis all the time that we can't see, that's not a violation of intelligence that goes on here?
Let's see.
For the terrorism part of it.
Yes. I have about 15 people that are assigned inside of different agencies, FBI, Joint Terrorism Task Force, some of the other counterterrorism centers where we have embedded our officers for information. But I get briefed 3 or 4 days a week on intelligence, threat information, classified information. And I will always do that. I mean, I want to know not just what is happening in the region in terms of what we know the presence is in the region and what types of cases are being worked, but also looking at global issues, because they all have an impact or could have an impact here. And so that drives how I train my police officers. If there's new tactics or patterns emerging in terrorism, immediately I have to shift gears and start trying to shift my agency's capability on detection and then response. So that goes on, like I say, just about every single day.
How often do you hear of a terrorist threat in the area and you stop it and you never tell us about it?
It's hard to measure. It's hard to measure how many things that you prevent. We feel like we have prevented incidents here. But there are things that we just don't share. We can't. I mean, for a lot of reasons, but there are things that we just can't share.
So going back to your attitude about the media and the difficulty and the headlines and all that stuff, you say you like to give them information, but how often do you say no comment? So
that's one of the challenges. Just back on the 10-year anniversary of 9/11, there was a legitimate, credible threat working. I made a decision after a briefing to move my department to 12-hour shifts and deploy a plan that I have to increase visibility, send some special teams out, and cover certain areas, critical infrastructure, things like that. And so how do you do that? How do you mobilize everybody on 12-hour shifts and have this incredible shift in visibility? And when the press says, why are you doing this? You can't say, well, because we're working a specific credible threat. So I find ways to message that. And so knowing that that's going to be a request from the press, I make the notifications to the union so the union knows, hey, look, there's a reason I'm doing this. I can't share it with you right now, but I will share it with you as soon as I can. And also knowing that the threat would go public. So I made a statement to the press that, look, this is the 10-year anniversary of 9/11. I'm going to make sure I have my people out there. We're going to be everywhere. Now, the threat was revealed a day later, but at the time I had to say something. You know, I had to say something. I couldn't do that without answering to the press.
The only, other than a few blogs, the only place that I could find anybody speaking negative about you is the chairman of the Fraternal Order of Police, the union, Chris Bauman?
Yes.
Who is Chris Bauman and why is he so irritated by you?
It's really not me. You know, that's just Chris. That's the way he is. I mean, if you look back when Chief Ramsey was the chief, he did exactly the same things to Chief Ramsey. In fact, I've compared articles where he's used the exact same quotes about Ramsey that he uses about me. That's just the type of leadership that he does. You know, he likes to constantly attack management. He likes to constantly attack me.
Were you a part of the union?
Of course. All my friends are part of the union. You know, I mean, I don't even think of my police department as union and non-union. They're all mine. His job is the union chairman, and his philosophy and tactics are attack, attack, attack. It doesn't bother. And I don't think Chris personally doesn't like me. I think that's just his style.
Let me read a quote. It's not about you so much. He says, "This is an administration without honor, and the leaders are out to enrich themselves at the expense of the public."
Yeah, that's classic Chris. That's just Chris. I mean, I look back at some of the old articles, because he has them all up on his website, when he attacked Chief Ramsey, you know, constant attacks, and Ramsey fired back pretty hard with him. I can't get caught up in that. You know, I got a police department to run, and I can't let his tactics to draw negative press, and if you notice, all of his attacks try and draw negative press to the agency. I got to keep focused on keeping my police department going forward, and those negative attacks distract the whole agency. And if I get sucked into that, I'm just hurting my agency, so I can't get sucked in. And it's hard sometimes. You want to defend yourself, and you want to say, wait a minute, this guy's saying stuff that's just not true. But the press is always looking for, whenever the press, you know, is looking for somebody to give a negative comment, that's where they're going to go, and I know that. It's just life.
Now, you're in a town, a city, the District of Columbia, that has, we saw Mayor Barry, he went to prison. Mm-hmm. There's a former city council member that's in prison now. Mm-hmm. There is another city council member that's been given, I guess, a 6-month probation or whatever it is, didn't go to prison. What's that do to you? How do you deal with that? Because are they your bosses?
Well, I work with the city council members quite a bit. I don't work for them, but I work with them. And you know, that body is there to help make the city function well. It's very distracting. especially for the police department. When you're a police officer and they're elected officials, and I think back to the days when Marion Barry was going through, his criminal issues, it's embarrassing because, this is the guy that signed your paycheck, essentially. So I try and, when these things are going on, I try and keep the police department focused. Look, we don't have time to get sucked into politics. We just don't. We've got to stay focused. The Metropolitan Police Department, as far as I'm concerned, is a shining star in the city. We have integrity. We have an incredible reputation for customer service and responsiveness, and we do a great job in fighting crime. Don't get distracted by all that crap. Stay focused and do what you got to do. So we try not to get sucked into it the best we can.
Is there a police department around the country that you admire for doing some innovative things that you've taken some ideas from?
There are. I'm going to constantly look. I mean, I have search engines that constantly look for things for me that other agencies are doing. I think there's a lot of innovative leaders out there around the country, and there's a couple of things. Actually, when I first started the Homeland Security and Counterterrorism business here in D.C. back in 2002, I looked a lot at what New York was doing. New York does a lot of great stuff. Although you have to remember that some things that are very effective in one jurisdiction, you can't pull off in another. But yeah, I constantly look at what's going on with other agencies.
You did a study when you were at the Naval Postgraduate School that you published, and you talked about the 9/11 Commission, and that should have asked, you said, why their officers didn't know the terrorists were operating in their community, meaning local communities. Why did you ever get an answer to that question?
Well, here's how I use that, and this is what I think of every day. And I wrote that thesis before I was the police chief, but this is something in my mind every single day as the police chief. Every time I am briefed on a threat, whether it is been, even if during the briefing I'm told, well, we don't know credibility yet. We're still trying to assess the credibility, but this is a threat stream that involves Washington, D.C. And even though the intelligence community who's sharing the information doesn't feel it's something to get ramped up about yet because we don't really have credibility, I respond and I take some action on every single threat that comes in. Every threat that comes in, I don't care if it's been deemed credible yet or not, I will take some action with the police department because of that statement. I'm not going to be sitting in front of the next 9/11 Commission and have somebody say to me, well, what did you do when they gave you that information, Chief? I always take some action because intelligence is intelligence. It's not perfect. It's as good as a weather forecast. You can tell me that the barometer is X and that it's going to be cloudy today and there's a 50% chance of rain. Take my umbrella. May not rain at all. I'm going to take my umbrella. So that's my philosophy, and that's why I put that in that thesis.
How much of a threat is there today compared to what there was back at 9/11?
I mean, people ask me all the time, how often you get really credible threats that we really do think that there's something, overt that's going to happen. It's not what people think. I've seen in the 11, 12 years I've been kind of the lead for intelligence here in the city, I've seen about 10 times when there was really, truly, a case working where there was a threat here to Washington, D.C. The FBI does a fantastic job. They've intervened on a couple here, most recently about a year ago with a person who was targeting the Capitol. So it is not an everyday, and the threats come and they go. We do have spikes in threat streams that come in. We do have occasionally multiple sources reporting the same type of threat, which is very concerning. But it's ebbs and flows.
So what's the worst thing somebody can say to you on any given day?
In terms of threat?
Yeah, just think, when do you say, this is not going to be a good day?
There's a lot of things that can make me feel that way.
What kind of things are there that come to your level?
Well, I think that I probably involve myself more than a lot of chiefs at levels down lower than probably I should. So the things that ruin my day, credible threat streams when they come in, obviously. Officer misconduct. I have a very, very aggressive position that I run my internal affairs to go out and actively do integrity checks and aggressively look for misconduct and corruption. And when we get cases where we have corruption, that's one of the things that bothers me the most. But those are the two biggies.
This isn't a corruption situation, but I want to show you some video that I know you've seen before. It's a snowball fight.
Oh, yes.
Let's run that and get your reaction to this.
What? He's got a gun? This dude has a gun in his hand. He's driving a Hummer and people are throwing snowballs at him. Does not seem like a good idea in any way, dude. They are still doing it. This guy's laughing. Are you kidding me? We're about to get shot. This is bad. Do not shoot anyone over snowballs.
Throw another snowball. Throw another snowball.
What is that?
Well, this is one of the places where I learned a little bit of a lesson in terms of the press, too. This is during a big snowstorm where we had a large group of people who, through social media, had organized this very large snowball fight. It was a pretty serious storm. The roads were pretty impassable in a lot of areas. And there's an off-duty detective who's driving through the area, and he's got a nice car, an SUV, and he's getting pelted with these snowballs. And he stops the car and gets out. Well, of course, he's not in uniform, so nobody knows he's a police officer. Then he gets pelted with snowballs. So in the course of this melee, he draws his weapon. So when the first calls came in from the press about this, we just heard you have an officer who's drawn a gun on the snowball fight, and it's on, I forget, one of the social media sites. I was in a crime briefing. I'm like, look, I don't have time to run out and give a statement to these guys right now. So I grabbed one of my assistant chiefs. I said, look at what the video is on the social media and go give a statement. So I look over his shoulder, and the first video we look at, the officer actually drops his cell phone and picks it up. We're like, oh, that's not a gun, that's his cell phone. They think it's a gun. So I tell the chief to go out there and make a statement that it's not a gun, it's a cell phone. Well, then we see the other video later where he actually does have his gun. So lesson learned there about, well, first, sacrifice the assistant chief. But secondly, you really need to know all the information before you give conclusive statements. But it was just a nightmare. I mean, I got hundreds and hundreds of emails and calls and letters. People were so outraged over that. I mean, that was a media nightmare for almost a year.
I've got a bunch of terms that when I was doing the research on this interview, that I wanted to ask you about. There are things that you use in law enforcement, and have you to explain them. What's zero tolerance?
It is a zero tolerance came out of, I believe it became very popular after the beginning of the transformation in New York. Bill Bratton, who was the chief, the big story was the squeegee guys. He had applied a zero tolerance approach to policing in New York, where they went after the minor offenders to try and reduce some of the disorder and crime in New York. And it worked very well, very well. So it took off in terms of a trend in policing. It is not one that I think works very well here. I think we've done it, and I think it has kind of the opposite impact here.
Why here?
Goes back to my first statement when we first opened up. My philosophy and what I feel with our community here is, let me give you an example. We go into a community where there's a lot of murders and a lot of shooting, a lot of robberies. Marion Barry talked about the 7th District, Anacostia. We go into Anacostia, we flood the area with police, we tell them to lock up anybody for any little violation of the law. They do. So they're getting the guy who's got an expired permit and taking him to jail. They're getting the person who's out front with an open container of alcohol, taking her to jail. And what we have forgotten is, even though this is the area that has the most violence, it is the area that also has the most victims and the most witnesses. And those witnesses are not going to talk to you. The perception over in Anacostia, when I took over as police chief and talked to people, was, you send all these cops in here, they're locking up our son for not having a permit, they're locking up my grandmother for having an open container of alcohol, and then all your cops are up the station processing their arrest, and the criminals take over our neighborhood. So the perception to the community was, either we're working in cahoots with the bad guys, or we just don't care. So when you do the opposite, I put foot patrol officers over there, pulled those zero tolerance teams out of there, and people start to get to know the police. They start to get to know you by name. They start to provide information. There was one particular community over there where that drove homicides. year after year. And after 2 years with the foot patrols, dropped it down to 1 murder an entire year. And that murder was closed because we got information from the community. So zero tolerance to me and my communities alienates the people we need.
How can somebody tell, especially another police officer that works for you, when you're mad?
Oh, it all depends. Let's see, I would say the most opportunity for people to see me mad is in my crime briefing. If I have somebody who in a crime briefing, we discover they have information that they didn't share with other people who needed it, and an additional crime could have occurred or another crime did occur, I think my body language makes it really obvious. And I don't have any problem, telling people, especially if they're people that I've appointed to positions to make sure these things are getting done. I think it's pretty obvious that person's not going to be there very long. I'll move a person in a heartbeat if they're not doing the job I put them in there to do.
As a person in command, what would be your recommendation to some others that are getting command for the first time in the way you treat people, and how tough do you have to be? Do you tough in the beginning and loosen up later? What advice would you have?
Well, for me, all of the people that in fact, my entire executive staff, all the assistant chiefs, we all came up through the ranks together. We competed in promotional tests together. I have a lot of respect for them. And I think that the thing that is most important is everybody that works for me knows that you could be my best friend. And I've had scenarios where I have people that I personally have been friends with for a long, long time. If you're in a leadership position and you're responsible for a particular area and you're not making it, I gotta move you. I gotta move you. I might have to demote you, take you down a couple of. I don't have any choice. It's not personal. It's not about you. I have to get the job done. People have entrusted me to get the job done, and I have to get it done, and I have to get it done through others. And so it's not an easy thing, but it is what's required if you're going to be a leader, and that's accountability.
So I saw a lot of stories about your salary. Did that tick you off?
Only in a sense.
I mean, you make $250,000.
Only in a sense that, first of all, a lot of the stories they talked about the top 3 salaries in D.C. There's myself, the school's chancellor, who makes actually more than I do, and then the city administrator. In that article, they refer to me by name and Kaya Henderson by name, the female school's chancellor. They never mention the city administrator, who's male and makes more than both of us. So I thought it was very sexually biased. And if you compare my salary to other major city chiefs, in particularly with the comparisons across city, my salary doesn't stand out at all. It's not such a big deal at all. And I wonder if I was male, if it would matter.
Who gets the most money as a police commissioner?
I don't know who it is now. I know Chuck Ramsey's up there.
In Philadelphia?
Mm-hmm, in Philadelphia. Chicago is up there. And then if you look at size of force, if you compare the size of force, there are police chiefs out there that have police departments. There's police chiefs in the region here that have police departments a quarter the size of what I have, that are making very close to what I make. So you have to weigh a lot of that stuff too. But
several years ago, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years ago, the population breakdown in this city was 70% African American. It's now 50% African American and 38% Caucasian and others. What happened? Where did the African Americans go, and what difference does that make today at all?
The population has shifted. I'd say that shift has occurred. At least initially, it was fairly gradual. Started about 10 years ago, and then there's been an acceleration in the last 5 years. I think the city is under the last Tony Williams administration, he was visionary.
The mayor.
Yes, the mayor put together this vision for the city to start revitalizing economic development of the city. He did gateways projects and things like that to try and turn the city back in a really good direction, which he did. In the course of doing that, one of the things that I think was a good decision is to move away from public housing concentrated poverty to the Section 8 model that is in place now. And so a lot of those public housing complexes that really clustered a lot of very poor folks in very poor living conditions, to get rid of those. So as Tony Williams moved through his vision, a lot of those public housing complexes were destroyed, and there's single-family homes in those areas now. So I think some of those folks are dispersed around the city now in Section 8 properties. Some of them took Section 8 properties outside of the borders of the district. But the more the district develops and the more development that goes on, and there's a lot going on here. There's 52 or 53 cranes out there in the city right now doing jobs. And so it becomes more expensive to live here. I think you're going to see a lot more of not just African American, but the lower income folks being inched out.
And the population's going up for the first time in a lot of years.
Population's skyrocketing here. I just did a 18-month analysis of the economic development in the city because it impacts my policing. And I put together a 5-year strategy for policing. And really over the next 5 years, policing is going to look very different because of the development in the city. It's amazing. So
the president said that he wants more police out on the beat. Does that make sense?
It's where they have to be.
Do you need more?
Of course I do. And that was the whole purpose of my study. In 5 years as the chief, I've never gone out and said, I need more cops. But I am watching, as a part of our crime projections, we monitor a lot of things that are not traditionally monitored by police. This economic development and the types of development that's going on here is going to impact workload for us. With the population skyrocketing the way it is, with the entertainment venues skyrocketing the way they are here, and the crowds that we're drawing, our nighttime population is now as big as our daytime population. I'm going to need more officers. I think it is not a fixed number of officers. I think we're going to need to be flexible. Surge officers when you need them. We can attrit officers down very quickly when we don't. But I think we're going to need to continue to grow the force a little bit right now.
What does cop mean?
Constable on patrol.
And do you like being called a cop?
You know, some of the names that we get, I actually think are kind of fun. In D.C., people, in the neighborhoods where we really police and we fight crime, they don't call us cops. They call us the popo. and I think I think it's an affectionate term, so to speak, between the criminal element and the police. For years, we were called the 5-0. So we'd ride into a neighborhood that was a drug market back in the crack cocaine days. They'd yell, 5-0. And so there's a lot of affectionate terms like that going on. Cop doesn't bother me.
121 officers in the district over the years, if the numbers are still right, have lost their lives as policemen. Mm-hmm. I think 60, some of those were killed, 61 or so were killed by a gun being shot. How much do you worry about that, and how often has that happened on your watch?
I worry about it every day. And in the past couple years, we've done some very, very risky operations to go after the most violent people in the city. The guys in the units that have worked these operations know that every single morning when we would get updates on how these operations are going, it was a decision for me each day. It's time to shut this down. It's time to shut it down because you're taking such huge risk. And we've got great police officers. They know the risk. They're very good at what they do. But I worry about it every day. We've had lots of officers shot since I've been the chief. I had officers that have been killed in traffic-related incidents. Thank God we've not lost an officer to gunfire in anytime recently.
How much control do you have over, and this is a big issue in the district, the cameras? I think, didn't the district raise about $92 million last year?
Oh, the traffic control?
On traffic control. Is that yours?
Yes, it is mine. We actually, I was actually the commander of the vehicular homicide unit back in 97, I want to say. We had 76 traffic fatalities in the city. And that's when the population was much smaller and we didn't have all the bicycles and all the pedestrians. We had 19 last year. I am a huge believer in photo enforcement. Bottom line is if you're traveling in a car at 30 miles an hour and you strike a pedestrian or a bicycle, they got an 80% chance of living. If you strike them at 40 miles an hour, they got an 80% chance of dying. That's just a fact. You slow people down, fatalities will go down. It is a fact. And I can tell you people slow down in the city because that $100 ticket doesn't feel very good. I know.
So you're going to keep it up?
I am.
What about the idea, people think that there's a quota on traffic control people, parking, and that you send those people out on their little Segways to put those tickets on cars and that they have a quota. Is there such a thing as a quota?
See, now that's not me. See, I'm very happy to say the parking enforcement is done by another agency in the city, but I do want to go back to what you said just a moment ago about the cameras and keeping up with the cameras. The other thing that cameras do that people don't realize is the majority of police officers that get killed in the line of duty are killed in traffic incidents. We've had officers killed in traffic incidents here doing traffic enforcement. And it also frees my officers up to go out and do the proactive policing that we need to do. So for me, the cameras are a win all the way around. The money doesn't come back into my budget. It's not coming back to me. I'm seeing the number of people losing their life drop dramatically. I'm taking a huge risk off of my officers from my officers being killed in dangerous areas. And those high-speed areas where we run those cameras, some of those places I won't put a police officer. The 3rd Street Tunnel, for example, because we had an officer killed trying to enforce traffic in there. So there's a lot of advantages to those cameras, and people, I think, really that look at public safety as a whole appreciate them.
I want to show some video back in 2008. It's an Associated Press report on guns, and then get your reaction to what's going on today.
In the nation's capital, a victory for supporters of gun rights, with the U.S. Supreme Court striking down a ban on handguns in the District of Columbia. The district's government wanted the court to uphold the 32-year-old ban, the strictest in the country, saying it curbs violent crime that would only get worse with guns in homes. At issue, how to interpret the Second Amendment. Does it protect an individual's right to own guns, or does it only apply to the collective rights of states to maintain militias? The constitutional amendment was ratified in 1791, but the court has never before given a definitive interpretation. Opponents of the ban say the law violates the Second Amendment, guaranteeing one's right to self-defense, and they say outlawing guns has had little effect stopping the city's violence.
What impact did that decision by the Supreme Court have on your job?
Very little, honestly, and people know so little about it, and there's such a perception that you've never been able to register a firearm in D.C. And I've had people say, "Oh, the homicide rate's down now since they've overturned this gun ban in D.C." But the only thing the Heller decision did was you've always been able to register a firearm in your home, just had to be a long gun. Handguns were not permissible. We've had about 1,600 semi-automatic handguns registered since Heller, but it's only permissible to have them in your home. You can't take them out on the street. We've not had one case where a homeowner used a registered firearm to defend their life or defend a burglary. Not one since Heller. So it's had zero impact on crime. I can't even think of a case where a legally registered handgun has been stolen yet from a home. That my only fear was that because we have officers' homes who are targeted to steal firearms, so maybe people would start looking to steal firearms, but nothing. So other than we've had some suicides, involving registered firearms, but other than that, Heller's had really no impact on policing.
So if the president called into the Oval Office and said, "Chief, what should I do?" what would you recommend to him based on your knowledge of the gun business?
And this most recent debate
just what would you do?
I think every major city chief in the country would agree with me. The goal is you can't prevent every incident. You have to try and reduce the harm when bad things happen. Large capacity magazines. There's really no reason for a large capacity magazine other than, devastation. I think the gun show loophole is huge. I mean, everybody agrees. I mean, that you should not be selling firearms to felons and criminals and things like that. So I think that's a biggie. And then the assault weapons. I feel for the gun collectors. I have my father and my brothers were all hunters, and down in Southern Virginia where everybody has a gun and it's safe because they actually have gun safety courses. But I think those three things would significantly reduce the number of casualties that we see. We're not going to stop everybody from getting them, whether they're legal or not. But I think it's important for the government to institute policies that at least are aimed to try and reduce the harm associated with bad events.
What would you do about the schools, and do you do anything now about having the schools
I do police
paroled?
schools here. We have police schools here for a long time. I have about 100 officers that are assigned to, they don't stand in schools. We have security that does, security for the schools, but I have about 100 officers that rove through all high schools primarily, but they also do the feeder schools and elementary schools. And I will continue to keep a police officer presence in our schools. I don't believe that police officers should be stationed at the doors and in the schools, but I do think police officers play a vital role.
I noticed when you arrived today, you're armed.
Always.
What do you carry?
Glock, 9mm.
And why?
It's what the department issued when I came on. I mean, it is a very efficient firearm. It's something that we've had in the Metropolitan Police Department now for 24 years.
Have you ever fired it, other than in practice?
I have.
For what reason?
And people who know me will be shocked. It was actually I had an attacking pit bull. 2 pit bulls attacked my partner and I. I want to say 95. So I discharged the pit bulls, struck and killed one of the pit bulls.
What was it? I mean, was there any other choice?
No.
How often does an officer working for your department misuse a firearm?
We have, over the years, we had a bad patch of years in the early 90s, I'm sure you found in the literature, but we have very, very few accidental discharges. We have very, very few unjustified discharges. 3 years ago, we went an entire year without one single police-related shooting death. And, in a city like this with 658,000 calls for service, I mean, our numbers of use of force with a firearm is so low. I think each year, since I've been the chief, there may be 6 or 7 incidents a year where an officer has to discharge a firearm, and in almost every single case against an armed assailant. So it's a very low number here.
How many people dial 911 a year?
I believe about 658,000 calls for service is about the average. What we get, 650,000 calls for service a year.
How many of those are significant?
Oh, that's a tough question.
How many of them are frivolous?
Let me put it this way. I'd say about 35% of them are the top priorities. Those are real, I need the police now.
If you live here, and I've lived here for a long time, you can rate the importance of an individual by the number of DC police that are leading his or her path through the streets. The president, when he moves, has how many vehicles and how many policemen do you have around him?
I wouldn't comment on that. We never give numbers on security, but he's the president of the United States. Lots.
But is it better off from if we didn't know he was in a vehicle, we wouldn't get, terribly excited. And when you come through, I've counted 8, 10 police, either motorcycles or police cars coming along with it. I'm sure you've thought this out.
I have.
And
I used to run the unit that ran the motorcade escorts.
Is that hard to do, to get ready to move a president around this town?
Yes, it is. It is very, very difficult, and to keep the city moving. I mean, we have the president, the vice president, first lady moving around the city every single day, and this is a busy city. But, I think, one, dignitaries do move around without those big escorts off the record that you don't know about. But, it's the President of the United States. His schedule is public. And if it weren't public, the press would be accusing him of hiding something. So when somebody that important who has a public schedule, for them not to have that type of security is just dangerous.
Cathy Lanier, Chief of Police of the Washington Metropolitan Police Department. We are out of time, and we thank you for yours.
Thank you.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.